This is HuffPost Live. I'm Ricky Camilleri. Last week, the Urban Institute published what is being called a landmark government-sponsored study that has sought to evaluate the underground sex economy. Through interviews with incarcerated promoters, pimps, and sex workers, the study reports that sex trafficking and prostitution is estimated to have brought in between 39 million and 290 million in 8 cities across the country just in 2007. The study also finds that the average pimp rakes in $39,000 a week and that they don't like being called pimps at all. While the study does take a non-moralistic approach to evaluate an illegal industry normally viewed through a somewhat puritanical lens, is it entirely accurate? Should we contemplate legalizing sex work to implement regulation, or is that neglecting those who are exploited by the sex trafficking? Is there a middle ground? Joining me now to discuss, we have Crystal DeBoise, co-director of Sex Workers Project, Jess Richardson, a sex trafficking survivor and sex worker activist, Laura Agustín, an anthropologist and author of Sex at the Margins, and joining us from the Moonlite BunnyRanch is owner Dennis Hoff and one of his employees, Ava Adora. Everybody, thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
So, for the studies, researchers interviewed 261 stakeholders and convicted offenders for it, including local and federal law enforcement officers, prosecutors, pimps, sex traffickers, sex workers, and child pornographers. Laura, I want to ask you first, because you've criticized the Urban Institute's methods of getting this data. What is it about this study that you find inaccurate?
Starts from the U.S. government criminalization point of view. So it treats everything as crime. It talks only to people who have been incarcerated or in diversion programs. It completely misses probably 90% of the reality of the sex industry. So it's an extremely partial view.
How does only talking to people that are incarcerated miss 90% of the sex industry? How does that happen?
When you do research and you do ethical research that's reviewed by people, you have to show that you're getting some kind of general view. You have to have different kinds of control groups. You have to make sure that you're not focusing on only one thing. It is completely biased to only speak to people who are convenient to researchers because they have been caught doing something. You don't know what that effect is, but you know that it's a very big effect.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that in interviewing mainly promoters, procurers, rather than sex workers themselves, the percentages of which they interviewed was off, they're missing a lot of the data as well?
Terrible, rubbish story. What can I tell you? It's one of the worst pieces of research I've ever seen. They've called it the sex economies, but it's really about pimps. Because the U.S. government is interested in pimping and wants to keep their anti-trafficking campaign going, they're focused on the people they're calling pimps and traffickers. So I think it's interesting to also talk to managers and people calling themselves pimps or not calling themselves managers and anyone. But you cannot make the stories that men in prison tell as though they were true to researchers who then use that as data. It's completely mad.
Just to clarify, do you think you would consider this a sexist study on the part of the U.S. government?
Oh, sexist isn't the word I would use. It's far more, it's just rubbish. It's methodologically bad. So when you see them bragging about the methodology, it's because they've used econometric acrobatics. If you look at the thing, it's filled with interesting econometric equations and all of that. But the whole thing rests on assuming that pimps and traffickers are the most important people, assuming that all the women who sell sex are victims, not looking at all of the normal kinds of things that go on for most people, and focusing only, it's like on the street, and only a few sex workers. It's just completely mad.
Now, I think when we discuss the sex industry, most people out there unfortunately view pimps as the heads of this and sex workers to be victims. Crystal, can you open up that dialogue a little bit for me and give us the actual realities of what it might be like for a sex worker in a relationship with their pimp or promoter? And with Dennis and Ava, I want to get to you guys in just a second to talk about it in the legal realm. But in the specifically illegal realm, Crystal, could you open up that for us a little bit?
Well, here at the Sex Workers Project, we work with people who enter the sex industry for a variety of reasons and in a variety of situations. It's an incredibly enormous variety of kinds of work and fields of work, and that particular relationship is really just one of many kinds of work relationships. We see people who enter the sex industry by choice, among other choices, and that's the best choice they feel that they can make for themselves, by circumstance, meaning they maybe wish that they could do something else, but their circumstances have led them to make this decision, and by coercion, meaning someone has forced them into the sex industry. And human trafficking, by the way, covers many industries, not just the sex industry. All different kinds of labor, people can be victims of human trafficking.
Mm-hmm. It's important to note that there are different kinds of victims of human trafficking. We have a graph that I want to pull up just to echo the point that you're making. Here we can see that domestic workers, agricultural laborers, and factory workers are also trafficked. Crystal, why do you think we only talk about trafficking when it comes to prostitution?
Probably for a lot of reasons. This is the type of human trafficking that has captured the imagination of Americans or the minds of Americans. I think we tend to gravitate towards it for a lot of cultural and reasons. Sex work is stigmatized, and people are interested in the topic. There's a dichotomy that sex workers are either victims or criminals, and we really have to examine that dichotomy and see that there's actually a variety of kinds of sex workers. And I've worked with both survivors of human trafficking and sex workers who weren't survivors, and also survivors of labor trafficking. And this is a phenomenon that's much, much broader than the particular circumstance of a woman who is working for a pimp.
Jess, you are a former sex worker. Do you consider yourself a survivor of human trafficking or a former sex worker?
Both, actually. We need to look at the differences between what our federal government calls a severe form of sex trafficking, which actually includes force, fraud, or coercion, versus sex work, where a person can enter for a wide variety of reasons, but does not include the language of force, fraud, or coercion. And I believe that's where this study sorely misses the boat. It seems that our entire government, including federal government, has somehow missed the common sense that we need to listen to the individuals who have been within the sex industry, whether being trafficked or as a sex worker. So from my experiences, I experienced both severe forms of trafficking and then escaped my trafficker to become a sex worker.
So talk to me about those differences and how this study ends up hurting someone on either side of that.
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that we can bring about any legislation that only affects one side. When we have any form of community or legal activism, it affects both individuals who are being trafficked and individuals who are sex workers. Mm-hmm. So we really need to look at the bigger view as to what the sex industry really is. And I think on both sides, whether it's anti-trafficking or sex work, there's a lot of segregation between the two. And I didn't understand that really until examining my own life, where when I was trafficked, the only people I knew were other individuals who were trafficked. And then when I was a sex worker, the only individuals I knew were other sex workers. I believe there's a deep segregation within this massive industry, the sex industry. And we really need to listen to all the individuals and the voices from within.
Dennis, Ava, you are a sex worker. You are a legal sex worker in the state of Nevada. Do you find yourself segregated because of the occupation that you've chosen to do?
Oh, I mean, personally, of course not. I believe that since anybody who works here pays taxes, we vote, there's nothing separating me from any other citizen.
I think what I take away from this study is that finally they're showing how big this industry is, and that these pimps, trafficking is a worldwide problem. Sex trafficking is incredibly brutal, and it's happening all over America. And because our politicians turn their head, it enables these people to work. And I'd like to use Nevada as an example. Nevada The business is illegal in Las Vegas and in Reno because the population is 400,000, over 400,000 people. Now, we don't have any problems in the rest of the state. Every working girl is tested every week, and in 33 years, we've not seen a case of HIV. We don't have any problems. In Las Vegas, where sex is illegal, they've just entered the 1,000th person arrested with HIV. Las Vegas is a disgusting cesspool of sex, and a lot of America is like that. Prohibition does not work. And if you want to eliminate the exploitation of these sex workers, the illegal sex workers, then legalize the business.
Mm-hmm. Jess, what are some of the problems that you have with the terminology used in this study?
I believe we need to look at really some common sense factors in defining some of these terms like pimping. Pimping, I believe in our cultural understanding, is a form of violence where it's very aggressive, and yet the legal definition of pimping is very different. And so when we group violent criminals together with someone who, a sex worker may have just, hired someone to be their bouncer or driver, that shouldn't be a criminal offense. Violence is something that is synonymous with trafficking, with pimping, and yet our legal definitions do not line up with that understanding.
What difference does it make, though? It's all illegal. They all should be prosecuted, and we either need to make the decision to crack down on it, enforce the laws that we have, especially on underage girls, because 40% of the illegal prostitutes were brought into the business at a young age. A young age. In Las Vegas, we're estimating there's 300 girls from 11 to 15 being pimped right now, all the time. So why doesn't the government either enforce the laws they have? Federal laws can put a person that traffics an underage girl in prison for life. Fill up the prisons with these people and get everybody's attention, or consider legalization.
What happens if we consider legalization, Crystal?
I think legalization is an important conversation to start, and one of the positive things about this report is that we can start having that conversation in this country. We really need to think through it closely. I think it's pretty clear that decriminalization would be have a positive effect on both survivors of human trafficking and sex workers. Our studies have shown that even those who are in the sex industry by coercion have not had good experiences with law enforcement, and it has not assisted them overwhelmingly in exiting their situation. And in many times, the criminalization has been traumatizing for them and has contributed to the hardships that they are facing. And then if you ask sex worker groups globally if criminalization is helpful to them, you will hear overwhelming no. Criminalization is not indicated by any sex worker groups as a positive contribution to what they need.
So how do we...
Can I point something out?
Please.
I don't know if you're going to mention this, but it's an important bias in this piece of research that it ends up being racist. So you asked about the methodology in choosing people in prison. The proportion of black men in the United States who are in prison is enormous, and they are more likely to have been caught as what you're calling pimps or traffickers. And they've put in the study interesting anecdotes about what the guys say about having a white girl or having a black girl. It simply reinforces this enormous prejudice against black men who are supposedly victimizing white girls. It's outrageous, and that's because it's missed all of the people who drive and bartend and do washing and sell wigs and rent places and do websites and all the other thousands of jobs that exist in the sex industry.
Well, that's interesting that you point out websites, because there is an aspect of the study that points out that the internet is changing the sex industry. How is it changing the sex industry, and is it for the better or just the same, Lauda?
Well, this is hilarious because this is coming like 15 years after everyone already knew that the internet changes everything, especially the sex industry. Here we have a U.S. government-funded study that tells us this incredible, we didn't know that before. Obviously, it means that you can advertise, and it means that people can advertise themselves. It doesn't mean that they have to have a pimp or an escort agency, but they might. They might have a good one, they might have a bad one, but it has the same effect it has on every other business relationship in the world.
It doesn't make it better. It does not make this business better. In my mind, a Backpage, who is now worldwide, is enabling illegal prostitution and sex trafficking. There's no question that a lot of the girls on Backpage are underage. There's no question about that. So why isn't the government stopping this? Why isn't the government stepping in and saying, excuse me, Backpage, you are enabling sex trafficking and closing them down? It's a blight on our society. It's not any question that illegal prostitutes have very high STD rates worldwide. Why aren't we locking these people down and saying this, Backpage, stop? You know, they did it with Craigslist. 27 governors sent a letter to Craigslist, and Amber Lyon interviewed Craig and embarrassed him, and he shut it down. The same thing should happen to Backpage. But no, the attorney generals in our states don't have the nerve to go after a company like Backpage.
Eva, I want to ask, you're sitting here, you're listening to all of this, we're talking about the autonomy of sex workers, the difference between illegal and legal prostitution. I'm curious how you yourself came to the decision of becoming a sex worker.
Well, I guess unlike many people who enter this business illegally, I definitely had a full choice. I mean, the difference to me is all about consent. I mean, even if you do choose to find yourself a pimp or do something like that, work on your own, you're still ultimately not consenting. There's still so many other things that you have to worry about, your safety, your health. When I worked here, I came here, I mean, to not only express my sexuality and to, ultimately have fun, but it was also, for financial reasons. I mean, school loans. I mean, I was an anthropology major. I did a lot of, humanitarian work all over Southeast Asia, working with people who've been trafficked and all of this. And it's so sad. It's ridiculous. And to think that there could be such a safe, legal option to do this kind of work where all of the positives can really be attained. It's so sad to me. It's ridiculous.
Is the BunnyRanch the first place that you've worked? Were you ever involved with illegal prostitution prior?
Oh, no, I've never escorted, never danced, nothing like that before this.
Mm-hmm. And this is what happens when you legalize the business and there's a supply of legal prostitutes, then men won't go to the illegal as much. You're never going to eliminate illegal prostitution, right? But you can slow it down by making the supply there. Because men, if they have a choice, they're going to come to a BunnyRanch as opposed to picking up a girl on the street, knowing that the chances of a disease are incredibly high, the chances that a pimp may rob them or take their financial information and use that, and the fact that they might get embarrassed and be on John TV or any of the other things that these cities think works. What works is get rid of prohibition of this. You bring
up a really interesting point, Dennis, that I want to take to Jess. Jess, by legalizing prostitution, essentially, do we end up protecting sex workers from something like being trafficked more because consumers would be more likely to consume what is legal, and only the ones who really want something that is sort of desperate and illegal would go to trafficked and endangered women?
I actually much prefer the language around decriminalization rather than legalization. In my experience in working with other survivors of trafficking, I have known multiple survivors who have come out of the legal brothels in Nevada. And the owners of the brothels may not know that the girls are being trafficked there because the pimp places them there. And I believe we really need to have an entire shift in the way that we view the different mediums or the different types of businesses surrounding the sex industry, because traffickers use escort services. They use strip clubs. They use brothels. They use all of these different mediums in which to sell sex. And they're used by both sides, both sex workers and people who are being trafficked. And so when
I want to go to Crystal here for a second. Crystal, in what way do you see similarities between trafficking and simply domestic violence?
Well, this is a great question. I find it in.
Yeah.
I'm having a sound.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we have you. We can hear you just fine.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm getting.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you, Crystal. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's interesting because when we talk about human trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're gonna move on. We're gonna try to fix your phone and move on for.
I'm getting someone on my line who's talking.
Yeah, that's probably me. But we're gonna move on for just a second to another element. I want to bring up the idea of the study again. We've moved away from the study just a little bit, and I want to bring it back. Lauda, do you think that while we have issues with the terminology of the study, most of the takeaways that people are having from this is that we should start looking into legalizing prostitution simply based off of the economies that have been shown through this study? Is this study a step in the right direction, do you think, or is it a step backwards?
No, it's not a step in the right direction. The only thing that was a step in the right direction was to admit that there is a sex industry, that there are multiple markets and many, many things happening. But they ignored 90% of it and focused on women who work in the street and maybe have an ad online and the pimps that manage them, so that it's extremely, the bias is so misleading that the information that you might have about the massage parlors and the peep shows and the strip clubs and all the hundreds of thousands of things that exist is invisible. So it seems to me that it's actually a step backward.
Well, Dennis,
what should they have focused on?
Go ahead, Dennis, real fast.
What should they have focused on? Because I don't understand this.
Mm-hmm. Crystal, I want to bring that to you if you can hear us now. What do you think they should have focused on?
That focus on the wide variety and the real-life experiences of sex workers are very welcome. Here at the Sex Workers Project, we see people who are working in the sex industry to take care of their children, who are working in the sex industry because they don't have work documents, that they've come from another country, because they've been cut off from other options. And we also see people who are working in the sex industry because they want to be. And I think that those stories are really needed to hear if we're going to move towards a more open and less stigmatized view of sex workers and victims of human trafficking, towards a more understanding and towards a society that really is interested in the well-being and human rights of this population.
But just to play devil's advocate for 1 second before we have to run here, there is a criminal aspect of it. It is largely dangerous, is it not?
Yes, there's no question about it. It's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And when you talk about illegal aliens coming in here and working in the sex business, of course they're exploited. They're going to be exploited, and there's only one answer. It's legalization. It's not decriminalization. Some of these people would like to see girls be able to work out of apartments next to somebody else, no health tests, without any regulations. No business can do that. A plumber can't do that. It has to be regulated and controlled.
Well, Dennis, Ava, Jess, Crystal, Laura, I want to thank you so much for joining me and having this really important conversation. I'm glad that we could break some barriers in discussing sex workers in this country. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And guys, keep watching HuffPost Live. We've got a lot more great conversations coming up.